the Democrat, Doug Jones, did something that no Democrat's been able to do in the statewide office, never mind the Senate, in at least 10 years in Alabama. That is beat the Republican. And so Doug Jones, now the senator from Alabama, beats the Republican Roy Moore. And going into this election, if somebody had told me that Roy Moore was going to win by 10 points, I would have said, okay, that makes sense. And if somebody had told me that Doug Jones was going to win by 10 points, I would have said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. There was really no way to know what was going on there. Polls were all over the place. There was no polls that really nailed it. But it's a good outcome, and there's a lot of fallout from this.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, I think the last Democratic senator who won in Alabama was in 1992, and that was Richard Shelby, who immediately switched to the Republican Party. I think he did it like the next day. It was that extreme. Maybe it was 94, but it was, one of those years or in the early 90s. And that was it. And of course, Richard Shelby is still the Republican senator from Alabama, and he, quite ostentatiously over the weekend, I mean, he had not been for Roy Moore, and then came out over the weekend and pretty much said, we can do better than this. I'm not voting for him. I am going to write somebody else in. And of course, there were quite a few write-in votes in Alabama, presumably most of them against Roy Moore, people who would have, theoretically anyway, been Republicans. The state is very, very Republican and voted for someone other than Roy Moore because they couldn't stomach it. I mean, there are a number of factors that happen here. I mean, if you look at the analysis that's coming out throughout the week, I mean, it pretty much shows the same thing happened there that happened in Virginia, although Virginia is a swing state.
Right.
And Alabama is hardcore conservative. But nonetheless, it was the same coalition that came out and voted for Doug Jones. It was a huge, really enthusiastic turnout of African Americans, which in a state like Alabama is really, really important because it's a big population. I don't think people really think about this, but it's true. The biggest populations of African Americans in the country are still in the South. Unfortunately, they're a minority, but it's 30% of the population in Alabama. It is a big faction and very, very decisive if they all come out and vote, and they did this time thanks to a number. Sorry,
I don't mean to be a stickler, but it's 27%, and the only reason why I say that is because they made up 29% of the voting population. So the black turnout in Alabama was massive and nearly what it was in the general election, which is, this is a special election, but continue.
Yeah, I mean, this is truly important. And, I think we can all understand why African Americans think it's important to vote against people like Roy Moore and, vote for someone like Doug Jones, who I think, had a very credible case to make to the African American community. He ran as a mainstream liberal with a lot of, very liberal ideas about economics and social issues, and was known as the man who prosecuted the KKK members who blew up that church back in the 1960s, killing 4 little African American girls. And I don't think people have talked enough about the symbolism of that. I mean, that is really an amazing thing, that the guy who prosecuted that case against the KKK in Alabama is now the senator. I don't think that's something I would have thought was possible, but it was, and largely due to this massive African-American turnout. But it wasn't just that. It was also these suburban, white, college-educated voters who presumably most of them had voted Republican in the last election, or there may have been some who just stayed home and went, it's not worth it to me to vote.
Particularly women.
Particularly women. And I think we understand why that might be. I mean, let's not forget that Roy Moore's reputation, he was always known as an extremist. He had this he had been kicked off the state Supreme Court twice, and everybody knew what he was. But that level of hypocrisy of a man who sold himself as this very super righteous, conservative Christian soldier turns out to be something, of a deviant who basically in his 30s had been stalking and molesting underage girls. And I think that for a lot of women, many of whom had voted for Trump and may be having regrets about that as well, maybe said, you know what, I can't do it. So that coalition, which is all the young people voted for Jones, a large African-American turnout, and then these suburban white voters, particularly college-educated voters, particularly women, that coalition is holding up. It's the same coalition that turned out in Virginia and other states a month ago, and now did it in a place like Alabama, which kind of shows that there's something kind of structural going on here, that there's something actual, a coalition that actually it goes beyond whatever, parochial, regional, or statewide concerns might be in these individual races. Because you wouldn't normally see that a state like Alabama and, say, a state like New Jersey would have that much in common, but they did. The turnout for these special elections is the same coalition of people. So this is encouraging, I think, for Democrats on a number of different levels. And, it means that, that the Democratic donors poured a ton of money into Alabama, a lot. And maybe this will loosen up that money for 2018 as well. It's going to be necessary. This is people act like it's a given at this point that Democrats are going to win the 2018 midterm. But that's not, it's hard.
Right.
Because they have got, the gerrymandering in the House and then the Senate, the burden that they have to face in the Senate is really high. Not impossible. I'm quite hopeful. But nonetheless, it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of organizing and a lot of effort. So this is just one more bit of evidence that maybe the Democratic coalition and Democratic donors and maybe even the party is getting its act together to actually challenge this, this
what we're dealing with
that we have. Yeah.
Well, look, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, let's talk about some of the specifics that we saw in terms of the DNC and other groups, what they did in Alabama. And let's talk about why, if it is the case that we're seeing the sort of same demographic, I guess, coalition and wave that is carrying it. Let's try and tease out how much of that is a function of Roy Moore being a predator and an extreme guy, and how much that's offset by Alabama being one of the reddest, if not the reddest state in the country, and what's going to happen around the country for this to carry through in 2018.